I think that we now have a much better idea of what's going on inside the create request function. However, we still have an error message on line 33 or so, and the error messages appear to be mentioning something about storage and something about memory. So in this video, we're going to get a much better sense of what this error message is talking about. Before we dive into any of the specifics here, I do want to make a very quick side comment. I'm going to say that in this video, you might be thinking I'm going way too in-depth on some of these topics we're going to be discussing, and it might seem like this is a video that is a little bit out of place. However, the error message that you're seeing right now is one that you will see on your own personal projects. And all the documentation out there that explains this error message is really very not helpful. So I want to spend a good amount of time talking about this error message because when you come into contact with it on your own, it's going to be a pain to troubleshoot, and I can just about guarantee that. All right, so here's why this error message is so troublesome. This is why it's so confusing. The error messages themselves, each of them, one says storage and the other says memory. Storage and memory are two terms that are used across two different topics in the world of Solidity. Okay, that's the first thing to understand. When we say storage and when we say memory, they are both referring to two separate topics. So let's figure out what those two topics are. So again, when we see these terms right here, sometimes storage and memory are referencing where our contract stores data, like where it stores arrays and integers and strings and whatever else. And then sometimes storage and memory are referencing how Solidity variables actually store values inside of our contract. Now these are two topics that are very closely related, but nonetheless, they're two different ways of talking about storage and memory. So you're going to see storage and memory, and sometimes it'll be in documentation that's talking about where our contract stores data. However, in other times, you'll see storage and memory, and it will be talking about how Solidity works with variables. So that's kind of challenging aspect number one. We're going to first speak about this first case right here, where we talk about storage and memory, and it's in reference to how our contract stores data. So we're going to first cover that because it's a little bit easier to understand, and then we'll come back and talk about this variable thing over here. And just so you know, when we are dealing with that error message that we saw a little bit ago, it's all having to do with this second case over here. However, all the documentation and blog posts and Stack Overflow posts you're going to find online are all talking about this first one. And this is the easier one. So all the documentation tells you about this easy thing. None of the documentation really makes this more challenging thing that is related to the error message that we see very clear. All right, so I think that's enough preamble. Let's just get right into it. We're going to talk about storage and memory as related to where our contract stores data. Okay, so this is all about where our contract holds data. On the one hand, we have one bucket of location, or one bucket where we can store a bunch of data, and we refer to it as storage. Storage is used to hold data between function calls. An example of storage is all of the different variables that we have initialized at the very top of our contract right here. These are all variables or pieces of data that are held in our contract's storage. Storage is available between function calls. So if we call one function on our contract and we modify one piece of data, that piece of data is available on our next follow-up function call. So in general, this idea of storage is something that we've been already working with a tremendous amount throughout this entire course. A good way to imagine storage as being just like your computer's hard drive. If you write some file, like let's say a text file, to your computer's hard drive, and then you turn off your computer and then turn it back on, that data, that text file, is still going to be there. It doesn't matter that you turned off your computer. You wrote it to some long-term storage mechanism, your computer's hard drive. So that's how we want to be thinking of storage. On the other hand is memory. Memory can be thought of as a very temporary place to store data. And as you see over here on the right, a good way of thinking of it is just like your computer's RAM. If you store some data in your computer's RAM and then turn off your computer entirely, like you cut power to it, no electricity whatsoever, and then turn it back on, any data that had existed in RAM will then be completely emptied out. It's totally gone. So again, Storage is all about preserving data. Memory is about very temporary data. We technically have seen an instance of memory data once already. So I can show you that inside of our contract right here. We have our variables up here that are storage data. But if we scroll down to, say, our constructor function right here, you'll see an example of memory data right here. So our arguments to our functions are technically memory data. When a function is called, it is given some arguments. And then when the function is complete and exits, those arguments are essentially lost to the void. And we have no ability to go back and reference those arguments again. So the arguments would be a good example of a memory variable. Okay, so hopefully this first way of talking about storage and memory, I'm saying that in this case, we're talking about storage memory as it relates to our contract data, makes a little bit of sense. And we'll see a better example of this as we work throughout this contract. But for right now, I just want you to understand that sometimes when we refer to storage and data, and you see these terms inside of documentation, it's talking about where our data is stored. So let's now take a break. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about the second context in which you see these terms. And this is by far the much more confusing one, but it's the one that is related to the error message that we currently see. So let's take a quick break and then discuss that in the next video.